And we're on.
We are.
Welcome everyone. I'm Michelle and this is Tony, and today we're going to be talking for about half an hour about a subject that's very close to our heart, and that is how do we understand autism? At the end of this, you will be able to ask us questions live. We'll be beamed through to you for your conference, and we're looking forward to hearing your questions and speaking with you. But for now, we're going to deliver this beautiful topic that we've constructed for you. So understanding autism, and
we're also going to go through how to connect with your autistic child, how to build affection and manage emotions. These are very important aspects of autism in the home environment.
Absolutely. So we thought we'd put together a case study of a very, very typical type referral that we consider in our daily work in the clinic in Brisbane. And that is to consider Luke. You can probably see your slides now. Luke, as a 6-year-old boy, recently diagnosed with ASD level 1 and has triggers that are very common in autism for big emotional reactions. And the triggers are the word no, wait, or hurry up. And when these triggers occur, almost a white hot rage comes in, and it's as if the rage is going from 0 to 10 in about half a second, and he's lost it, and he will not calm down, and all the typical parenting, wonderful strategies that we have in our toolkit don't seem to work for Luke with autism. So what on earth do we do? And often this type of scenario that I've just painted for you with Luke is occurring on at least a daily basis, sometimes more often than that. So if we go to the next slide, you can see the messages that we would like to convey to you. We have 3 takeaway messages. The first are knowledge and attitude. We know from our many years of working with autism that actually it's the best interventions for autism are knowledge about the condition itself, about how that condition actually manifests, what it looks like in your own child who has autism, and then importantly, what sort of strategies work. So, but first of all, how do I understand my child? What is going on? Why does he do the things he does? Why does she melt down? And why is it that she can't gain her equilibrium back on her own? Why does she need solitude to calm down? Why can't I as mum help her calm down? So knowledge is crucial to be able to feel calm to parent the child in a way that's going to be effective when we have autism. The second important aspect, though, is attitude. We found that attitude makes an enormous difference with our kids on the autism spectrum. If we come in with an attitude that is about embracing them with an open heart, seeking to understand with curiosity, with a respectful attitude for who they are and how they are, it makes a world of difference. So that's going to be a key topic today. And our last takeaway message is self-care. The research is clear in this area, and that is that parents who have kids with autism are amongst our most stressed out parents in the community. It is the one condition that tries your patience, gives you so much stress and anxiety about the future, and is so puzzling until we've worked out the key of what autism is. So in that space, we just encourage you as much as possible, and we'll talk about how to do this, to have a toolkit of your own so that you can have the energy, the heart, and the attitude to be able to help your child. So 3 takeaway messages: knowledge, attitude, and self-care. But we're going to turn now to knowledge. So the first aspect of this talk is, what is autism? And we particularly chose this picture because often you can't tell that the child is autistic. You can't see it. You can if it's Down syndrome, you can if it's other conditions, but when it's autism, the child looks just like other kids. And so how do we understand this? Now, we do have what we call the Bible in psychiatry of all the diagnostic labels, and there are agreed upon international definitions of autism. However, my very favourite is actually one that was written by Tony. And it's on this slide, this next slide here. Autism describes a person who has found something more interesting to do than socialise. And that sums it up. In essence, for a person with autism, the most puzzling aspect of their life that causes endless confusion and stress is other people. How they think, what they do, how to please them, how to avoid them, and these how to cope with their smell. All of these aspects of dealing with other humans causes enormous stress and anxiety. Now, when you are socially challenged, you need to still find meaning in your life and pleasure in your life. And this is where we see the special interests of autism. You also need consistency and predictability, because other humans are not predictable at all. They're very inconsistent with their behaviour. And so you seek consistency and predictability, hence the routines, the rituals, the repetitive behaviours that we see in autism. So if we go to the next slide, and you'll see a very complicated slide here that's entitled Autism and the Brain. And the reason we included this is not to go through it in detail, but just to be very clear that autism is not caused by parenting, that it's actually a neurodevelopmental condition that implicates most parts of the brain. And if I can just quickly take you through that on this slide, the most, I guess what we would call as the core part of the brain that's implicated in autism is the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal lobes. And so we kind of call autism a frontal lobe condition. The frontal lobes help us to read a face, infer other people's intentions, motivations, read emotions, actually make sense of our own emotions. They're implicated in our sensory awareness, and also in how we self-regulate, how we organise our behaviour, regulate emotions, etc. So the cerebral cortex is working slightly differently in autism. So all those areas of function will be affected. But if we can come down to the midbrain, the amygdala, this is known as the social brain, and Tony will be talking about this.
Yes.
It's hugely important to understand the function of the amygdala in autism. So we'll come back to that one. We also know that the hippocampus, which is the centre for memory in the brain, is working slightly differently. So for our guys, they can't necessarily embed down all of the long-term memories we would hope for, like autobiographical details, even memory for pleasant events, and they can have great difficulty generalising their learning. So it's very important to understand those things about autism. We know that the temporal lobe is often implicated, which has huge ramifications for both language and, again, emotion regulation. We also know that the glia, which is interconnective tissue in the brain, is not necessarily as integrative in its function, which is hugely important because it means that important parts of the brain are not working together. And so we get the unusual behaviours and stimming, and also other cognitive differences happening, learning differences that are happening in autism. And lastly, on that slide, you'll see that the cerebellum is implicated. So this sits at the base of the brain, and this is about movement. There's often movement disturbance and movement disorder in autism, and that's because of that differently functioning cerebellum and how it's communicating with the rest of the brain. So quick whistles and stops kind of little tour of the brain and autism. But let's talk now about the next topic. Tony.
Why strong emotions and behaviour problems in autism? And we have our diagnostic criteria about social relatedness, routines, consistency, change, sensory sensitivity, and so on. But often when talking to adults, what we discover is that the parents may say, our biggest problem are the tantrums. It's the anxiety. Anxiety drives all sorts of behaviours. How do we get that person to manage their emotions and their behavior? And so we look at a part of the brain called the amygdala, deep within the brain. You have two of them right down there. And what they do is tune in to the sensory system for danger or threat. And when a perceived threat occurs, alerts the body to a fight, flight, or freeze response, and an energy to cope with that tiger that is going to eat you or something like that. And so your heart rate increases, you pump blood that's rich in oxygen from heavy breathing to the muscles to have that power and strength and so on. And so there's a certain threshold at which the amygdala will spot threat and alert the body to react. So what's going to occur here is that in autism, the amygdala are often enlarged, but also overreactive to what would be perceived as a mild threat from other kids, not the other kids would say, well, that's nothing quite significant, and that's what mum and dad said. It's not a big problem. But the overreaction, and when that occurs, it's very much a fight-flight reaction that is going to release a lot of energy. So sometimes when we're looking at emotion management, it's actually energy management, a huge explosion of energy. But another component is that the amygdala is connected to the frontal lobes, the thinking part, which basically says, hang on, amygdala, cool it a bit. It's not that serious. These are the consequences. Put it in perspective. Go, chill out. And as maturity occurs, you are better able to cognitively control your emotions. Well, there seems to be less connection between the amygdala and frontal lobe, which means that often the person themselves is not aware they're about to lose it, but also less able to cognitively control their emotions. That's why they've got to explode. They've got to smash things. They've got to run away. They've got to escape. And that's very much of concern for parents. So that's the amygdala. Again, not bad parenting. It was there when the person was born. We have another slide here on a different way of thinking. And that different way of thinking has many expressions. Sometimes it can be thinking that's phenomenal with Lego or playing a game of chess, or all sorts of things with computer games and so on. And you think, wow. But the thinking can also be different in terms of especially affection and affection repairing emotions. We had Matthew, who was 11 years old, and we were talking about when you're upset, would a hug help? And many other kids say, no, go away. I don't want to be hugged. It makes me worse. Why are you squeezing me? How does squeezing me solve the problem? And in that, he said, I fail to understand why the exertion of pressure on the human body should be considered comforting. Now, for parents, this is devastating because your child is in obviously extreme despair, and what you desperately want to do is to get them to feel better. And your standard strategies of compassion and consoling and affection and touch and kisses and things like that, in fact, may be counterproductive, and you are pushed away and they're not working. What may work is solitude. It may be distraction, all sorts of things. But it means that your child was not born with a manual to explain what to do when they get upset. And so you'll use conventional strategies and then find they don't work. And you think, what else do I do? Now, there's another component here we call alexithymia on the next slide. Alexi is absence of words to describe feelings. And so the person has a difficulty converting thought and emotion into speech. So when you say, how were you feeling? The person says, I don't know. Okay. What were you feeling when you hit him? I don't know. And so I'm now going to, should we say, complete the sentence from the autistic child. I don't know how to grasp one of the many thoughts and emotions swirling in mind. Hold it, identify it, and explain it in speech so that you will understand. Now that means it's very difficult for the person to convey what's upsetting them. However, we have found that the person can have an eloquent expression using music. Find me a music track that describes this. Lyrics, writing poetry, in typing an email, or art and music therapy. So art and music therapy can be used as a means of communication of the inner thoughts and feelings, and why some autistic individuals take a career in the arts. They sing in perfect pitch. They learn to play the guitar or the piano fantastically, but it's their way of communicating their self. So in the next slide on alexithymia, there are problems with expressing and enjoying also positive emotions. And what you try and do is cajole, jolly them up, and won't work, may not resonate with happiness in other people. And knowing how to relax and say, come on, just relax. I don't know how to. They can block it. They can explode to cleanse the system. But just to relax, they don't know how to. They're going to need help. But also affection, that is to express it and respond to it. Now on the next slide, we've got extraception and interoception. This is hot off the press. This is very new stuff, actually. We're delighted with it, but at this stage, it's predominantly descriptive. Now, extraception is the ability to perceive external sensory experiences, what you hear, see, touch, things that come into your body. How do you perceive them? And in autism, they often amplify them, that the sound is unbearable, the light intensity, the aroma, the type of touch is more than I can cope with. But interoception is how you perceive internal signals of, I need to go to the toilet, having a headache, hunger, proprioception, where you are in space and so on. So often they're unsure that they will, when we have those who can speak fluently, they say, it's not just my senses of hunger, need to go to the toilet, it's also sensing emotions. And they'll say, I've got a feeling, and it's not a nice feeling. I know it's not a nice feeling, but I don't know whether it's angry, sad, or scared, but it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I know it's there, and it very quickly gets out of control. So they know that there's an unpleasant feeling, but may not know exactly what it is. And if you don't know what it is, you may not know how to manage it.
No, absolutely. And I was just thinking, this is a good moment to say this is a core reason often for the 0 to 10 in half a second, because they're not picking up the signals early to be able to regulate and say, oh, I'm starting to feel tense, I'm starting to feel worried or anxious, I need to step away from the situation. They'll just keep going, not noticing until it's too late. And then it's like emotional incontinence. They'll have an accident and we'll all get hurt.
Okay. And as a parent, what you've done is you spent that child's life reading them. And you know the mannerisms, the action, the look in the eye, the situation. And you can probably tell when the child's about to lose it far before they do. And you just sense, hello, we got a meltdown on its way. How do you know? It's the look in his eye, right? We need to take that on board. So what we ask you to do is what I call a foreign phrase dictionary. What mannerisms, what action, what look, what situation heralds a meltdown? We need to know that. It's a foreign phrase dictionary. What does that mean about the emotional state?
Absolutely. We're going to talk about another topic now in terms of understanding your child, and that is their experience of social experiences, of social interactions. So if we go to the slide on emotional sensitivity, we used to consider, when I say we, the research community in autism for decades described a core deficit in autism to be lack of theory of mind, which translated is empathy deficits. So empathy deficit became common parlance to understand autism. We now know, with the wonderful wisdom of hindsight, that that was wrong, that actually our guys on the spectrum have oodles of empathy. There's now what's called the empathy over arousal hypothesis, which essentially means that the person is overly sensitive to experiencing the feelings of another person. They're overly sensitive to your mood, to your anxiety, disappointment, to your stress levels. So if you are starting to feel impatient, frustrated, irritated, or angry with your child will be able to pick that up. And unfortunately, that negative mood will contaminate them to the extent that they will start feeling not only the same level of your negativity, but probably amplified because of the amygdala being enlarged and the different pathways to the frontal lobe. So they have huge emotional reactions. However, it's really important to know this because it really underlines for us as parents, as teachers, as carers and psychologists, the importance of our own self-regulation. So if we can self-regulate in terms of staying calm and patient and able to think calmly, we are offering a huge tool for self-regulation to the child. They have a chance of being able to self-regulate. When we understand that hypersensitivity, we can work as much on our own emotion regulation as we are on assisting the child to understand their own emotions and how to regulate them. So if we go to the next slide and talk about how our kids are coping with their extreme levels, often extreme levels of anxiety, it's worth mentioning here that most of the research around the world, as we've been looking at autism, it's pretty much always tied anxiety to autism. There's even an anxiety hypothesis in autism that maybe if you have anxiety in your body, then that is a cause of some of the features of autism, like the repetitive behaviours and rituals. So most kids with autism will have some level of anxiety that is a problem for them on a daily basis. Not 100%, but high levels. 80 to 90% will have anxiety. The difference is in autism that anxiety can look different. It can look like, for example, as this slide says, oppositional defiant disorder. But if we break down what's happening for the child, if we think autism, when we see their temper tantrums or their what may be called manipulation or even non-compliance to any request that's made, it's often not about a willfulness or maliciousness in intention. It's actually about feeling completely at sea, very, very anxious and trying to get control of the situation. So if they can refuse to comply, they maintain some control. If they can't use their voice, they will use their temper tantrums. If they have alexithymia and can't talk about their feelings, it will come out in a big storm, and that can often get them out of exactly what they want to avoid because of anxiety. The key is if we can understand it this way, if we know that's what's happening, we can assist the child with their anxiety problems, and we can scaffold them in terms of making accommodations to their environment so that they can feel calm enough to be brave enough to trial new things. And new things is a massive trigger for anxiety for someone on the autism spectrum. Before I go to the next slide, we have got a word for this. We call them domestic terrorists. So these are the kids that have such high anxiety at home that it's not what we think of as anxiety, which is often a very meek and mild child who's perhaps hiding behind the sofa or very avoidant.
Very timid
person. In this case, they can be very, very vocal, shouting, screaming, having tantrums, and control the house with their emotion. And that's a domestic terrorist. And they're the kids we're worried about that we want to help.
Superficially, they look angry, but they're using this to control their environment.
Control their environment, because otherwise they can't control it. They don't have a voice, and they're not feeling. They're often the ones that are diagnosed with a comorbid or co-occurring condition, ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. It's often actually meaning that their environment doesn't suit them at the moment, and they are not feeling understood, and they're not being assisted with their anxiety or scaffolded at home as they need, or at school as they need as well. Now, the next part of big emotions is that we know that children who have high levels of anxiety often have massive sensory issues, and that's what this next slide is about. If you are someone who doesn't have a sensory processing disorder, as it's pretty much diagnostic to have that if you're autistic, if you don't have that, it can be very difficult to understand that the sensory difference is not just a difference, it's not just a preference, it's actually painful. So what looks like a temper tantrum, oh, you're just not doing as you're told, you must eat that sausage or piece of vegetable, whatever it is, there's actually a feeling of such disgust, pain, intolerance of being able to cope with the sensations in the body that that particular stimuli is creating, that the person literally can't tolerate it. So instead of this being oppositional defiant behaviour, we found it's more helpful to understand the child's sensory profile on all of the areas of sensitivity that Tony described earlier, and to as much as possible accommodate them. So this is not giving into a child's temper tantrums. This is about understanding that the child doesn't have the capacity to tolerate those sensory experiences. And so we try to make the environment more tolerable. Over time, with maturity, the child can learn internal strategies for tolerating the sensory experience that they find difficult. However, unfortunately, the sensory processing differences of autism don't just go away by themselves, and we haven't found that there's any treatment that can banish them. They're a lifelong part of autism, but fortunately the child can often learn strategies as they get older to find ways around to be able to cope. But this is an important clue in autism that we're dealing with anxiety differently, we're dealing with behaviour differently. There's often sensory issues behind behavioural problems. Now the next slide, hugely important. As you know, if you know and live with and love someone on the autism spectrum, we all know they often have sleep disorder as well, or sleep problems as well. The sleep issue can affect the duration of sleep, the quality of sleep, and it means that they often don't get the REM or the depth of sleep, the deep restorative sleep that they need for good brain functioning in the day. There is a hypothesis that this is part of why a lot of our kids have high levels of anxiety and difficulty with memory, because these issues are linked. So one of the things we would very much encourage you to do if you have a child with behavioural problems, huge emotions, anxiety, is have a look carefully at their sleep and do what you can as a priority, plan A, manage the sleep problem. Because if the child can sleep, we are equipping that child to deal with their sensory issues and their anxiety issues to such a great degree that a lot of the behavioural problems or the challenging behaviours of autism really diminish. So there's a lot of good programs for sleep that you can consult with a psychologist to get good sleep hygiene going. But if these have been trialled and failed, we can encourage you to go along to a sleep clinic and do some sleep trials to see if there's something else going on, like a sleep apnea is very common in ASD, and that can be treated to great effect. So sleep is an issue. So as a summary slide next, why do we have these strong emotions and behavioural issues in autism? The reasons are multifold, as we've gone through today. There's slow or delayed perspective taking, that theory of mind, the difficulty with reading and understanding people. There's problems putting our own emotions into words so others can understand them, but also so that we can understand them, or the person with autism can understand them and regulate them. There's missing your own body cues, so you don't get that opportunity to act on the emotion when it's small and it gets too big and then it's too late. There's obviously a different neurology going on, which means different sensory perception, learning style, differences in how they perceive and can regulate their own emotions. There's genetics. We haven't talked about that, but we understand autism to be primarily a genetic condition. There's experience and learning. A lot of social interactions have been difficult for the person. So that person can feel that others are not only confusing, they're toxic, they hurt me, they yell at me, or they tease me, or they bully me.
Yeah.
And so they want to avoid people. They don't necessarily see people as an avenue to solve their problems, to debrief problems to talk with, or to even get a hug, as Tony was saying earlier. There's also a different level of ability that can come in with autism, as you know, different ways of learning. There can be co-occurring conditions like language issues or intellectual issues for learning as well. We talked about the empathic over-arousal hypothesis. They feel our emotions keenly, probably stronger than we do, particularly the negative ones, and can amplify those so we get more meltdowns and behavioural issues. We've talked about the sensory processing issues that add into emotional problems, and poor sleep can occur. So armed with knowledge about the condition and how the brain is working differently and why, we can actually step into a space of understanding how and which strategies to use to better support that child so that success is possible and they can maximise their potential. But there's two other key components, and the next one
is attitude. And when they focus on attitude, there's a lovely T-shirt on the next slide there. This was actually true. It was on a teenager with autism. I was visiting the States and doing a presentation, and on his T-shirt it said, "People like you are the reason people like me need to take medication." And so sometimes what we're looking at is the attitude of other people and how they make autism worse. Sometimes actually, Michelle and I feel we're not concerned about autism, we're concerned about neurotypicals and the bullying and the teasing, the intrusion, the interruption, the sensory experiences, the lack of understanding. And we talk about theory of mind, that is the ability to work out what neurotypicals are thinking and feeling. The autistic person finds that difficult. But there's also lack of autistic theory of mind. That is to know how the child thinks, what they are prioritizing, how their mind works is going to be very important. And if you don't know that, it's going to make it worse. Now, the next slide is on attitude. And here we have embrace and celebrate. The child is different, not defective. They're just different. And it's understanding and respecting that difference. It's a sense of optimism. And I find that positivity works wonders. If you have a negativity towards your child, it'll make you and them depressed. If there's an optimism, it's likely, and if you're going to travel life, go with optimism. If you're going to have a distorted reality, become optimistic. Okay.
Definitely.
Yeah. It's a difference, not a defect. It's looking at the positives. And it's also being very aware that this child will have strengths and weaknesses. And if we're not careful, those things that are below par, we are going to try and make them average. But in autism, there will always be abilities above average, whether it be making things with Lego or singing and so on. Extend them, develop them. Autism gives you talents. Identify the talents, extend them. It builds up very positive self-esteem and attitude. It's an adventure of learning. It's not a problem to fix. It's understanding their style of learning. Now, on the next slide, this is an important one. If you can really listen to your autistic child, you'll never be worried about when they will say, I love you, because they do. Oh, yes, they do. But it's not conventional. It may be a touch. It's sitting next to you. It's sitting next to you, and sometimes the hand is on your knee, and you think, oh my God, that's so powerful. Yes. Don't move. And then off they go. And you have to readjust the affection that will come from the child. They will give love and affection. And I suppose if I look at a personal view of autism, the most important thing you can do as a parent is love your child. It's love.
It's love. Yeah. It is. They pick that up.
Yeah.
As much as they do our anger, irritation, frustration, the energy of love, the frequency of that is transmitted.
Yes.
And that causes relaxation, and that allows a sense of self-acceptance that I can be safe
and tolerance
and enjoy myself.
And no, whatever happens, mum and dad still love me.
Yes.
And however I can do this, but their love is just eternal.
Yes.
So important.
Totally.
Yeah.
So our next big topic, as we come to the beginning to come toward the end of our presentation today, is self-care. We cannot emphasize it enough, and I hope you enjoy my beautiful yoga cat. So I put that in as a personal reference. So my own self-care program is yoga and our beautiful 2 ragdoll cats. And this is actually quite autistic, I've realised, because many on the spectrum will find the solace of yoga because of the movement, and it can be done in solitude, and cats, because cats are, after all, autistic dogs. So there is a resonance going on here. Love cats, and many of our guys on the spectrum do too, and they love dogs and rats.
They do, and just say very quickly, when you look at how yoga affects the brain, yes, it affects specific areas of the brain, particularly the autistic areas. So yoga is actually therapy. No,
it's actually therapy. Yeah.
Now the next one related to that is physical activities. That is, the person needs to move. There's a lot of energy. They need to be going around. So sometimes, although they're not sitting still, in fact, they find great difficulty sitting still. They're wandering around, they're moving and so on, but they're still listening. They're still absorbing, even if they're not participating. But they need a lot of physical activities to burn off the energy on the swing, on the trampoline, is really good for emotional, should we say, release. A lot of physical activity.
Absolutely. The next one in the toolbox, and when we talk about the toolbox, by the way, on the slide we're on now, we're talking about a toolbox for the whole family. Certainly the child on the spectrum needs their own toolbox for autism, for anxiety, and to be able to cope with all the stresses of daily life. But parents need it, siblings need it too. So this is a project for the whole family. What physical activities? And don't think sport, think movement. How do we move our body? Emotion needs to move through the body. Sitting still, not doing much will increase anxiety and depression. We need to move, as Tony said. We also need to relax. We need rest and digest times. This is true relaxation. It can involve screens, but please don't make it only screens for relaxation, because screens take a lot of our mental energy too, a lot of focus and concentration. We need time in nature. We need time to just have a bath, be in water, have a rest and look at the sky and the clouds, read a book if that's available for the person. The relaxation rituals may need to be taught. In autism, they don't always know how to relax intuitively, but this is something we can teach them as parents. Psychologists do a lot of this work, teachers. You can learn to relax through yoga, for example, as one example. A lot of awareness activities from the mindfulness movement can really help with relaxation.
The next one is thinking tools. And this may be that they, the difficulty can be, I know what to do, but I can't initiate it. And the person needs prompt. Either you say it to remind them, or preferably you use, shall we say, a sequence. What we're going to do now, next, and later. This is the schedule or plan for the day. Once they know the sequence, then they can relax and prepared for change. And that thinking tool can also include how you can explain things by demonstration, giving them information on things, etc. So it's understanding the autistic way of thinking can help.
Absolutely. We need sensory tools, and this is about ensuring, like I was talking about earlier, that the world is more comfortable. So we might even avoid certain sensations because they're painful. For example, going to a shopping centre without noise-cancelling headphones might be too painful, so a meltdown is inevitable. So we use the noise-cancelling headphones is one example. If there's certain tactile experiences that the child can't bear, they could carry with them a sensory tool, or even if it's a piece of silk, if they love the feeling of that fabric, or it's something that's going to cancel out the negativity that comes into the body on the brush against human skin, or whatever it is that's their trigger. Our friends in occupational therapy really help with what we call a sensory diet to ensure that the child can regulate well because they're not too distracted by the sensory processing issues of autism.
Next one, social. In autism, two's company, three's a crowd, and there can be great emotional energy that is consumed in trying to cope with lots of people around. So social tools may be to reduce the social experiences of the individual. Also, there are some people who just get autism, and when they are with grandma or someone they know, they just seem to calm down. So the social tool may be the person. Another social tool is a pet. It may be the dog or the cat that just seems to soothe. Another is just being alone. And it's being alone, not necessarily lonely. And for emotional restoration, sometimes the person needs peace and tranquility and solitude, perhaps nature. Use affection, but ask permission and ask how much. If you want a hug, if they say yes, you may say a hug, a number 1 hug, a number 2 hug, or a number 3. 3 is very intense. 1 is just a quick hug and that's it. So they feel in control. They can predict what you're going to do. Because they can predict it and they're in control, they can enjoy it.
And right at the end of the toolbox, but hugely important, is pleasure tools for the whole family. Some pleasure tools that you can each use individually and others that you use in dyads. Remember, one's company, three's a crowd? No.
Two's company, three's crowd.
Yes, that's it. So we need solitude, but often you'll find in family relationships a one-on-one can work best. But then sometimes, occasionally, if possible, all the family doing something pleasurable together can be good. But finding the pleasure for the person, and it's often different in autism. Now, on your next slide, as we come to the end of our presentation today, we know that there hasn't been enough time in the 30 or so minutes that we've had with you to go through all the strategies to equip you for the questions you have today. We do have a whole suite of online courses you can do. So we've put the link up there. Our company, if you like, the organisation we work with around the world is Attwood and Garnett events. So we point you to our website for our training courses that we do in autism. On the next slide, we've put just some of our books, but these books particularly pertain to affection, expressing affection with your child, reducing anxiety in your autistic child who's age 4 to 8. They're the books with the yellow 10 steps to reducing your child's anxiety and having fun with feelings. And Tony's also written 2 books, exploring feelings for anger and then another for anxiety, particularly for your 8 to 12-year-old child. And these really flesh out our ideas for the emotional toolbox, both for the child on the spectrum and yourself as a parent. So as we end today, there are 3 take-home messages we want to leave with you.
Yeah, knowledge. Become an expert in autism. You're an expert in your child, but it's an expert in autism too. Read, listen, take wisdom from people. Attitude is very important. Yes, you want lots of programs and so on, but what can be very important is that positive, optimistic attitude. It's that ability to encourage success by a positivity as well as the actual program itself. And finally, self-care for all concerned. Having autism is tough, and it's tough especially for families. And so you need to look after yourselves as parents, because you're there for the marathon, you're there for life. So look after yourself, pace yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tony. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. We're going to stop the recording now. We hope you have got a lot out of it, and we look forward to taking your questions next. Thank you.